Hello, and welcome to the Culture Track at the third annual Python Web Conference. I'm Laura from 6 Feet Up, and I am thrilled to welcome Daniele as our next presenter.
Thank you very much, Laura. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me clearly wherever you are in the world. First of all, a huge thank you to the organisers of this conference. It's nice to be here again another year later. I know how much work goes into putting on a 5-day conference, and doing it online must be another level of effort required, I think. So thanks. It's really nice to see people, even if it's through a screen. It's something we've been missing, and I appreciate the opportunity. So, also, of course, thanks for inviting me to talk. Now, some of you know me already. I'm Daniele. I am Chief Collaboration Officer at Divio, a company I've been with for 7 years now, which is a long time in this industry. And my work is concerned with collaboration in making work successful, specifically work that takes place across boundaries. So work between developers and customers, between product teams and their users, between internal teams. So, for example, I make sure that I'm responsible for making sure that our developer users are successful through our developer relations efforts, through our documentation strategy and output, by ensuring the efforts we put into our products always reflect user needs and so on. And I really love this work, and I believe it's crucial to the success of our product and of any product company. And that's going to be the theme of this talk. If you don't know me from Divio, you might be aware of work I've done in Python and Django communities as an organizer of events, as a core developer of the Django project, as an enthusiastic participant in the African Python movement, where I've attended numerous and even organized some conferences there in different African countries, or been involved in the organization of, I should say. And it turns out that I'm also an international authority on the subject of documentation. Who knew? Divio is a web application deployment and cloud management platform with some pretty big customers, some of whom I can't mention here. But if your work is deploying applications or you need to manage cloud infrastructure, you might find that Divio can help you by doing some of the difficult things for you so that you can get on with the business of developing applications instead of fighting with infrastructure. And I should say that we are hiring. We're looking for a Python Django developer in Sweden or Germany. I can thoroughly recommend working at Divio. If that's something that is remotely interesting to you, please come and talk to me, because I'd be delighted to tell you more about that. I'm going to move this thing over there. I think that's probably better. Good. So I want to talk to you about programming for pleasure, and it was really interesting to hear Eli's talk before this one, because there's such an overlap of concerns. And I think I was intrigued to see how Eli talked about some of the same things that I'm going to talk about, but in a way that's much closer up at the personal level. And I hope you saw that talk as well, because I'm interested to find out what the other connections are. Anyway, what's going on with my screen? I've pressed the wrong button, haven't I? There we are. Right, now, you know, in jokes, the doctor's got some good news and some bad news. Well, Dr. Daniele, I'm afraid, also has some extremely ugly news. But we'll start with the good news. So the good news is that programming, what many of us do for a living, is intrinsically enjoyable. Programming is pleasurable in itself. Great. The bad news is that most software, the output of our work, is substandard. We, as an industry, make software that doesn't solve the problems it should be solving. We make software that irritates people, inconveniences people, wastes their time and money, sometimes even hurts people, and in rare cases, manages to kill them. So if that's the bad news, the ugly news is that most software is substandard because programming is intrinsically enjoyable. Why is software bad? Software is bad because programming is fun. Great. Now that I've spoiled your day, let's try to find out what's actually going on in all of this. We need to unpack it. The good. Programming is intrinsically enjoyable. Let's start by trying to understand programmers. First of all, let's ask ourselves, what do programmers like to do in their free time when there are no constraints on them? What do programmers tend to look forward to doing when they finish work? And as far as I can tell, the answer is more programming. And this is really quite unusual amongst professions. And partly it's because it's possible to do it. You can enjoy programming at home after work, unlike, for example, dentistry. You know, however much a dentist loves dentistry, the scope for practicing it for pleasure at home after work tends to be a little bit limited, and you would need to have very understanding family and friends. Perhaps you've seen Marathon Man, the film with Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier. It doesn't make me feel more comfortable about the idea of hobby dentistry. And I think people who judge other people's pastimes to be weird, I don't like that. I don't like it when people call, everyone should be allowed to have a hobby if they can. But still, if someone told me that what they did in their spare time was hobby dentistry, I would find it more than just a bit unusual, and I wouldn't want to participate in it. But still, it's not just about things like dentistry, which sounds sinister when you cast them as pastimes. Look at these other things that you could do for a living that don't tend to get done at home. Some can't be done at home, really, like air traffic control. But many of these could be done at home in your spare time without alarming or annoying your family or endangering the neighbourhood, but they still tend to remain professional and not leisure activities. And when you think about what people do for pleasure and which professions people in fact bring home with them, you realise that programmers are really unusual in how much programming they do when they're not at work, how much programming they do for their own enjoyment. And why is this? Well, I think that there's a perfect constellation of factors at work that make programming the thing that programmers want to do for fun. It's not just possible, it's easy. So you can open your laptop after dinner to look something up, and then 20 minutes later, you realize somehow you fell into doing some programming without even realizing you were taking the steps to get there. It's a leisure activity that requires minimum effort to get started doing. You can do it sitting down. You don't have to change your clothes or shoes. You don't have to leave the house. You can do it in any room in the house. Entering and exiting the activity involves a minimal shift of context. It's clean, which I think is a very positive thing in its favour. It's mostly silent, and it takes up very little space, and you don't need to have a shower or wash your hands before or afterwards. You can do it while having a drink, on the sofa, or even in bed. You can even present a conference talk from sitting on your bed, in fact. So there's nothing to stop you doing these things that you do when you're programming. And it's meaningful. When you're programming at home, you can achieve results that are just as meaningful and significant as the ones you do at work. You can do things of equal impact. It's not an idle activity, or it's not just an idle activity. And finally, it's pleasurable in itself. The process is intrinsically enjoyable. And this is the most important point. What drives the activity along, what fires up the engines in the first place and then keeps them roaring, is this pleasure, the pleasure of the activity itself. So, programming is a craft. It's a skill. It's a craft as a power, and that's literally where the English word comes from. So, programming is an inventive, creative craft, one that conjures new things into existence that weren't there before, and it directs all that power and creativity at problems. And any activity that combines these three things of problem solving, creativity, exercise of skill is one that can answer to really deep human needs and can provide an almost endless sense of satisfaction. So it's a cycle. There's a problem answered with creativity, and then the solution that's realized through the exercise of skill, and that's a cycle that can keep renewing itself. And that's the intrinsic pleasure of programming. It's what makes it enjoyable in and of itself, independently of its results or outcomes. And it's a really deep pleasure. It's not the kind of pleasure that touches us briefly or lightly and then is gone. It's a pleasure that demands a lot of us it demands that we dig deep into ourselves, and it comes back with equally deep and significant satisfaction. So it's a really profound pleasure. And if programming were a pharmacological product, the authorities would make it a controlled substance. So, lucky us, that what we get paid to do is so powerfully enjoyable that we choose it for our leisure time as well. But, as we said, bad news. Most software is substandard. It's a blight on our industry, and the whole world runs on software. Everything from booking an airline ticket to the firmware on your television is substandard. It's the whole world is blighted by this, and it shouldn't be news to you, since you not only use so much of it, but you actually probably make some of it too. And this pain of bad software is like old misery. It just spreads outwards to haunt as many people as possible. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, very few of us get to make software that kills. The vast majority of us don't even get to make software that causes really substantial harm. But an awful lot of us are involved in the creation of products that waste people's time and money very effectively and inconvenience people. And we are responsible as an industry for a worldwide permanent state of irritation and frustration. And it might be low-level frustration and irritation, but it's everywhere all the time. It's the background noise of our industry. It's a kind of industrial pollution. And literally billions of times each day, the software we make fails to solve the problems people were expecting it to solve and causes new ones. So why? Why is so much software so bad? It doesn't happen to other professions, that the professionals routinely make substandard products. It's not because programmers aren't good programmers. It's not because software is particularly difficult. But still, software engineering teams, populated by the best possible programmers, following the best possible processes, believing that they are making the best possible software, still continue to make bad software. And I think it's that most substandard because programming is intrinsically pleasurable. Software is bad because programming is fun. And if you thought that was ugly enough, I think that the more we have fun in our work, the worse we make our products. And ultimately, I think that programmers are condemned by the nature of programming itself to make bad software. And that's the argument that I would like to persuade you of in this talk. So look, this was the nature of programming: problem solving, creativity, exercise of skill. The pleasure arises from the combination of these three, the pleasure of the activity. So to a remarkable extent, programming is its own reward. And I think that's actually the first sign of trouble, because in programming, the pleasure lies in the activity and not in the outcome. And that's a dangerous state of affairs. Programmers spend their time in the process and little time with the product. Even when we use our own products, we use them in different ways from the real users. We don't often know how the real users use them. If it were really the product that mattered to us, we'd spend as much time testing the product and living with it, doing things with it, as we do creating it. But we don't, not as individuals, nor as teams, nor as companies, nor as an industry. So everything starts with a problem, with someone's pain. The problem is a gap between what exists and what's needed. And the product, the solution that the programmer is supposed to invent, should be something that closes that gap. But the thing that drives us, that moves us as we work, it's not the pain of the person who faces the gap. It's the pleasure of engaging ourselves to close it. And why not? Personally, it's much more satisfying to me to concentrate on my own pleasure than it is to face someone else's pain. I don't suppose you're that much different from me in that respect. But the product, the software that we create in the process, that can only be judged on how well it answers someone else's pain. And that is something that is systematically excluded from this picture by programming's cycle of pleasure. I'm sure you've heard it said that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That could even be true. But what you hear much less often, which is definitely true, is that when you are a talented, creative and skilled problem solver, everything looks like a tasty problem. And we programmers, of course, we are problem solvers. We love solving problems and we're good at it. To programmers, therefore, everything looks like a tasty problem. Unfortunately, however well we solve problems, unless the problems we solve are other people's problems, we will never make good products. But other people's problems are not tasty or pleasurable. Other people's problems are pain, and that's much less interesting to us and much harder for us to understand. One of the issues here is that there isn't one problem. There are two problems. First, there's the problem as pleasure, the one that makes programming the activity it is enjoyable and satisfying, that we love to dive into and get lost in and find ourselves in. That's pleasure. And then there's the other problem. That's the problem as pain. That's the pain of the gap between what exists and what's needed. And it doesn't exist in the activity of programming. It exists out there in the world. It exists in the task that someone else, by the way, is struggling to achieve because the product to achieve it didn't exist. And it's just not that interesting to us. Firstly, because, as I said, it's someone else's, not ours. And secondly, because unlike the problems that we face as programmers, these problems of pleasure, it's because the person who has the problem is not a programmer. They're just a user. They're passive. They're a passive victim of unfavorable circumstances. And who on earth wants to get involved in the pitifulness of other people's problems? Well, not me either. And that's just how it is. We're much more interested in, we want to spend more time dwelling upon our own pleasure than we want to spend contemplating other people's misery. Sometimes the two overlap like they do here, and that's great. That's where the programmer can draw upon the nature of programming as this motivating engine, and they can direct all the power at a problem that is someone else's pain, and it does happen. But it is blind and pure coincidental luck. It's just chance. There's nothing holding these two things together at all. So any product that comes to exist through the creative exercise of skill includes both a problem as pain, which is someone else's, and a problem as pleasure, which is ours as the programmer. I hope you've seen Kurosawa's film, The Seven Samurai from 1954. There's a village, and the villagers have a serious problem as pain. Their village is forever being raided by bandits, and the seven samurai are persuaded to do something to help them. But the samurai are not particularly interested in the villagers, but they do get interested in the problem when it becomes a technical problem as pleasure. And that's also the problem that we, the audience, become interested in. That is the question, how will the samurai, outnumbered, overcome these dreadful and fearsome bandits? That's what we want to know. And of course they do it just in the same way programmers do, by being resourceful and skilled and inventive and cunning. And I tried to find an image from the film featuring the villagers, but I couldn't, because nobody cares about the villagers, not even web search engines, because they represent the problem as pain, and people are only interested in the problem as pleasure. So the film is about the problem of how to defeat the bandits, a problem as pleasure. It's interesting, unlike the problem as pain of the villagers. The villagers are rather pathetic and snivelling and helpless, and they mostly hang around in the mud waiting to be harassed and humiliated by bandits. And also, they're not even very honest or likable. So the samurai don't care about them very much, and neither do we, the audience. So whether you're a samurai or a programmer, and frankly it's quite hard to tell the difference sometimes, it's really easy to forget the original problem. The problem as pain that gave you a job to do, something to become interested in it in the first place. And sometimes it's okay to forget about the problem as pain, if there is enough overlap. But there's no guarantee of overlap, and if we fail to address the problem as pain, we won't get paid by the villagers, and our products will stop being successful. And that would be okay for samurai who are only doing it for fun, but those samurai have a job to do, and otherwise they remain hungry samurai. And if they're going to do a good job, they had better be successful at solving the villager's problem as pain, even if they don't find it very interesting in itself. And the same for programmers. You can solve what you like if you're doing it only for fun, but if your product needs to succeed, it damn well better be successful as solving your user's problem as pain, even if it's not of interest to you. And so unfortunately, if we're concerned with the outcome, with the software, with the product, then it's the not so interesting pain of the user that we must force ourselves to pay attention to, and we must tear ourselves away from the pleasurable problem of our own activity, our programming. It's my contention that every creative craft faces this risk, the tendency to fall into the arms of its own intrinsic pleasures and neglect the pain that it should be solving. Every creative activity has a product, and it's the product that matters. So here's a programming example. Here's my brachiograph project. It's the world's cheapest, simplest pen plotter. You can build a pen plotter for about 13 or 14, 15 euros, including the cost of the Raspberry Pi to drive it. And it's not a commercial product, but it's still a product. And it exists to solve some real-world problems, even as a hobby project. The problems are, how can someone do something fun and meaningful with a Raspberry Pi and some cheap servo motors? How can we take the most basic hardware resources and do something creative with them? How can I, as the creator of this, make it cheaper and easier for beginners to be successful with? How can I make the output better? And those are problems as pain. They're gaps in the world that exist outside the project. And that's what the project's about. And I've had so much fun with this project, thinking it up in the first place, coming up with solutions to those questions and other ones, testing my creativity, solving problems, putting my skills to work. And what I realized was that sometimes there was an overlap between the problem as pleasure that I enjoyed and the problem as pain of the project, but not always. And all the time I wasted in the project, when I dived down rabbit holes of cleverness and achieved nothing, was when I was trying to solve problems of pain. Every single improvement to the project has come when I faced up to problem as pain, instead of getting tangled up in problem solving as pleasure. And that's the trap that we professional programmers, as teams of programmers, as companies that make products, that's the trap that we face. And that's because programmers were made for solving problems. We're the best problem solvers on the planet. We face tasty problems, and we're not afraid of challenges. And we want to overcome them in ingenious and imaginative ways. And the next thing, we're in the grip of our own deepest pleasure drives. And as I said, if programming were a pharmacological product, the authorities would have to make it a controlled substance, because it's a danger that creeps up on you. You know, if it jumped out of the shadows and gave you a terrible fright, that would be okay. You'd run away in the opposite direction. You don't even notice it coming, because it does so quietly and it comes up behind you. One day you're solving a problem of pain, and the next thing you don't know what happened in between, but somehow now you realize you're engrossed in being a good programmer making a bad product. And eventually we realize this and we stop, but not before we spent a lot of our energy in this pursuit and added a few more stones to programming's global pyramid of harm. So that's why I believe that programmers are condemned by the nature of programming itself to make bad software. And to make it worse, there is a lack of natural external checks on this tendency, which would at least mitigate it. So programmers, we don't have a monopoly on problem solving or creativity or exercise of skill. These things provide the same kind of pleasure in every activity, every profession where they are to be found. For example, in other kinds of engineering. But it's very noticeable that civil engineers very rarely build bridges or dams that fail to meet the expectations, fail to solve the problems of being a bridge or a dam. And I've never heard of an aeronautical engineer adding features to an aircraft that no one actually needed, but which were added because the engineer got carried away in the flow of problems as pleasure. These things don't just happen. Why doesn't it happen? Why are other engineers not seduced by the pleasures of their craft in the same way that programmers are? Why are they better at facing up to problems as pain? And I think one reason is quite simple and obvious. Other engineers face consequences in a way that software engineers rarely do. A bridge or dam that collapses or an aircraft that falls out of the sky is a disaster at the very top of the pyramid of harm. Whereas our failures in software mostly take place at the bottom, where they irritate almost continuously and inconvenience very often, but they pollute, but they don't cause catastrophes, mostly. So we continue to get away with our constant industrial pollution. And it's interesting that we're now 200 years after the Industrial Revolution, and we're realizing only really recently that industries need to be held to account for their low-level pollution just as much as for their catastrophic failures. And I wonder when societies are going to decide that programmers need to be held to account for software pollution too. And I think that it will take a lot less than 2 centuries for that to happen, assuming that we've got 2 centuries of civilization left in front of us. And in the meantime, I think we can also turn our attention inwards to our industry itself. I think that we as a profession should be self-aware and self-critical. We're quite good at that, actually. We do a lot of work to understand why we do what we do. And we often ask ourselves if things really are there should be. But one question I don't think I've really heard is fun a cultural problem for the software industry? So I think that one reason why programmers find it so easy to turn their gaze away from problems as pain is that since the 1970s, along with this spirit of invention, programming culture has increasingly become infused with an ethos of fun. Fun has colonized the industry. Nobody on the planet, not even kindergarten children, seems to expect to have as much fun as the programmer in the 21st century. And the language, the practice, the imagery, the tone of programming culture are relentlessly playful, ludic. Even our language, even Python, for example, is named after a comedy troupe. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's how it is. And I think it's also not a coincidence that the world's most sinister corporations provide their programmers with offices that look like playgrounds. Fun has taken charge. And in such a culture, it becomes ever harder to see, never mind contemplate at length, the problems of pain of other people. So everything, inevitably, in programming, from its culture to the nature of the activity itself, has a tendency to bend the programmer towards the pleasurable solving of their own problems and away from solving other people's problems, those problems out in the world. And if that's a good analysis, it at least gives us something to consider. For example, I don't think it would really hurt us that much to dial down some of our expectations of fun. Our workplaces do not need to be chocolate factories. And I know what some of you are thinking, and that Daniele doesn't really sound like an awful lot of fun. He's a middle-aged misery guts. And maybe you wouldn't be wrong. But I'm not actually saying that work needs to be less enjoyable, because play is not the only kind of pleasure. Fun is not the only kind of satisfaction. And perhaps it would even be to the benefit of quite a few of us if we could separate our work and personal lives more clearly, so that we could understand more clearly the kind of rewards that we expect in each sphere, and experience the pleasure of play and the pleasure of work better in each context. And maybe it suits a certain kind of employer to have their workplace seem like a fun house that you don't ever need to leave. And maybe there's another example. Maybe what we can try to learn as individuals is to become, let's say, more pain-seeking, or at least more pain-listening. And one thing we can do as teams or companies is to ensure that we have people in significant positions whose job it is to hear about and then make product teams do something about other people's pain. And of course, it has to be made possible for people to do those jobs effectively. So you've probably seen the film Jaws. the beaches are open and people are having a wonderful time. So Mayor Vaughan doesn't want to hear that the beaches should be closed because there's a great white shark in the water eating people. And the valuable, painful, bad news that Police Chief Brodie has that could save the day doesn't get to change anything because somebody didn't listen. So I think that is happening. The developer advocate, are they only delivering good news to the community? Perhaps the most valuable thing they could do is not go to a conference and brilliantly share the company's product to the audience, but bring back disappointment and pain and oblige their colleagues to face up to it. Well, what reception do they get when they do that? Or the product manager. Are the product managers in software companies making sure that the product is full of great, new, exciting features? Or are they ensuring that users' pain is heard and amplified and made explicit and understood and turned into product targets? And from my experience, that happens not enough. So I think this is something that is going to have to be forced upon us. If we are to make better products, programmers need to face more pain. We, as individuals, as companies, as teams, need to be dragged forward to face it, to face the pain that is the problem that our users need to have solved for them. And we need to have that pain pushed in front of us, or we need to be pushed into it where we don't want to see it, and where we don't want to have to deal with it, because it's pain, because it's someone else's pain. And we, it seems to me, will never do this ourselves. We need someone to do it for us, or even someone to do it to us, and we are not going to thank them for it very much, because who wants that in their lives? Not me. I'm a pleasure seeker too. So this is kind of my conclusion, for what it's worth, that if we are to make better products, our work needs to become less fun. And honestly, I don't really know quite how to feel about that. And also, I don't know quite what to do about it. But I think it's a problem. And since you're programmers and you're also clever at solving problems, perhaps you've got some good ideas about solving this one. So thank you very much.